Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to moderate the session this afternoon on nuclear fuel cycles, debate on multilateral approaches. I have already been in some excellent panels today, and I know we have good ones coming up, so the pressure is on us to make sure that the quality of the discussion stays high. On that note, I'd like to go ahead and announce our speakers all ahead of time, and then we will go ahead and go straight down the line before engaging in discussion. Immediately to my left is Mr. Tom Koppen, who's a researcher at the Center for Conflict and Security Law at Utrecht University. Mr. Koppen is a special advisor for the Netherlands at the 2010 NPT Review Conference, was a special advisor for the 2012 NPT Preparatory Committee meeting, and his research focuses on the international nuclear non-proliferation regime, arms control law, arms control supervision, and nuclear export controls. To his left is Caroline Joron. Her previous positions include working for the French government in charge of coordinating national positions related to the Euratom Treaty. She spent 13 years with the French nuclear industry, first with Kojima and then with Areva, and was the director for non-proliferation and international institutions until 2010. She also served on the advisory committee of the Euratom Supply Agency. We then have Dr. Kang Jun-min. He's a visiting professor at the Department of Nuclear and Quantum Engineering for KAIST. His previous positions include as a visiting scholar at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and he worked at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation, or CSAC, and Princeton University's program on science and global security. He also is a member of the panel on the International Panel of Fissile Materials. And finally, we have William Tobey, who is a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. Will Tobey previously served as the Deputy Administrator for Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation at NNSA in the U.S. Department of Energy. He served on the National Security Council staff under 3 presidents, focusing on defense policy, arms control, and counterproliferation. He also participated in international negotiations, ranging from the START talks with the Soviet Union to the 6-party talks with North Korea, and he currently serves as the chairman of the board of directors for the World Institute for Nuclear Security, or WINS, in Vienna. As I was asked to serve as the moderator and also a speaker, I'm going to jump in and just set the panel up with some of my own remarks before we move on to the other speakers. I first want to extend my thanks to the Asan Institute for holding this excellent event and for inviting me to speak as well. I certainly, as many of you, I think, hope that my participation will be an annual event as the Asan Nuclear Forum becomes an annual event. We will each speak for between 5 and 8 minutes, and then I will take the opportunity to ask some questions of our panel before turning it over to you in the audience. I also, for my own remarks, want to acknowledge Sharon Squassoni of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, with whom I've been partnering on a multi-year project related to the fuel cycle that we call New Approaches to the Fuel Cycle. And this project for both of us grew out of a concern that there were experts across various communities, and interestingly enough, we have those communities represented here, policy, law, hard science, diplomacy, the industry. But historically, I think that these communities have talked past each other when it comes to talking about the future of the nuclear fuel cycle and the risks inherent in those activities. So I want to begin my remarks by asserting that in order to develop effective approaches, we have to start taking a comprehensive look at the fuel cycle. And for me, that means that no single technology, no single policy is going to adequately deal with the risks that are posed by by nuclear power in general and the fuel cycle specifically. But we must grapple with those risks if we're going to take advantage of nuclear power as part of a balanced low-carbon energy mix. And the challenges come from the current structure of the nuclear fuel cycle, and they include serious proliferation and security concerns. Fundamentally, the pursuit of the fuel cycle is seen as a sovereign choice, and there currently exists no global political consensus regarding this agenda, and regarding the idea that there is a collective security value to developing shared principles governing the choices that are currently seen as independent and sovereign choices alone. Further, there's a sense that only bad states, and I use that in quotes, bad states use the fuel cycle for dangerous purposes, and therefore the answer is to address these bad actors individually and not the environment in which they operate. Relatedly, there's a perception that, and particularly among the industry, that additional constraints will only make it harder for responsible companies to do business, and they won't affect those that are taking a more dangerous path. So with that set up, and in the spirit of saying something a little bit controversial to start our discussion, this dynamic to me has many parallels to the current gun control debate in the United States, where guns and ammunition playing the part of enrichment and reprocessing, and the Second Amendment of the Constitution is in place of Article 4 of the NPT. There's a history and an orthodoxy that is inherent to these arguments, a struggle to balance the individual rights, or in this case, state rights, with the need to recognize that the world is a very different place than it was when these relevant sacred texts were written. And there is a stunned inability for those outside the discussion to even understand why it's so hard to realize that there must be change, or we will face unacceptable dangers for the long term. A handful of states already host national enrichment and reprocessing facilities, which we know, and new entrants into the nuclear energy arena continue to explore the developments of sensitive ENR technologies. The players are really, unfortunately, divided into currently the haves and the have-nots. But there's really the haves, the have-nots, the might-haves, the doing business with those who have but not having themselves. There's really a variety. But the major reasons for continuing national supply capabilities include the security of supply, existing sunk costs, support for existing military programs, including naval programs, if not the production of weapons, protection of sensitive nuclear technology, and the desire to not disturb existing markets, and this is particularly true on the front end. From the perspective of those countries that would like to acquire a national capability to enrich or reprocess, only one of these given examples is applicable, and that's security of supply. So I would argue that security of supply is better and frankly more economically achieved through diversity of service providers. And yet still countries interested in acquiring a national capability may be motivated by additional items that were not on the list for the existing suppliers, and these include prestige, sovereignty, and perhaps the desire to develop a latent nuclear weapons capability. So at the time now where the nuclear industry is being pulled in two different directions, especially on the front end of the fuel cycle, which is that there is a trend towards increased globalization of the supply chain, but also a consolidation of major suppliers because of a long hiatus in growth. Under this environment, we actually have perhaps a good opportunity to make some changes. Currently, the market is global, and companies have increasingly sought partners and joint ventures for investment. Controls and technology have largely restricted the development of multinational enrichment and reprocessing, and that the exception to that is in Europe. But there are examples of multinational commercial efforts that are successful and profitable. Unfortunately, there are no analogous success stories for multinational commercial reprocessing. The current nuclear fuel cycle structure has satisfied most demands for nuclear fuel cycle services, but has not satisfied them on the part of waste storage and disposal. And yet new nuclear states appear to be more interested in comprehensive fuel cycle services that encompass the back end, suggesting again an opportunity for new arrangements. We all know there have been a lot of past and current proposals. I'm not going to detail the history, starting with the Baruch Plan and going through Mohammed al-Baradei. Alternatives to national fuel cycle capabilities can range from minimalist to incrementalist, or incrementalist approaches to complete revamping of the system. Most proposals have tended to be minimalist, focusing on adding assurances to the existing structure. But the weakness of many of the proposed approaches is they're trying to apply a market-based solution to what is fundamentally a political problem. The fuel supply market functions efficiently. States that might be concerned about politically driven fuel cutoffs are not reassured by approaches that preserve the current network of supplier states and companies. And indeed, it's not even clear that the proposals advocating a restructure of the market would have an impact on the current supplier's market control. I quote a 2010 study by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which observed, quote, "The emphasis on ensuring security of supply of other services, such as reactor construction, fresh fuel, enrichment, and reprocessing, is misplaced. All of these services are supplied commercially at present, and a customer country currently has a choice of suppliers that may well be wider than that which would result from implementation of initiatives that create a two-tier system of nuclear supplier and user countries." So I think that when we look for the vision for multilateral approaches, we have to think about a more integrated approach. That's my conclusion, that a system has to be based on policy principles that apply to all aspects of the development and deployment of sensitive fuel cycle technologies, meaning that it connects the front end, where there's a broad consensus about threat, to the back end, where there's a larger perception of need. And a principled market-based approach to the fuel cycle can begin to be implemented within the current market landscape without requiring revolutionary restructuring immediately, and step by step would create a fundamentally more secure global fuel cycle marketplace when it comes to proliferation and material security, even if a final, complete, realized vision is actually never achieved. And so I'm going to turn to the rest of our speakers now, but I will maybe come back in the Q&A to some concepts of what is it about a fuel cycle that would actually make it more secure and proliferation resistant. Because as we've seen, simply the word multilateral or the concept of multinational is not enough. It's how we actually pursue that. There are also attributes of a system that I think would be reinforcing of the concerns that we all share. But I'm going to move on to our first speaker, and then we'll come back to some of those issues in the questions and answers. Tom.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you to the ASAN Institute for having me here. I will be talking to you a bit about a multilateral approach to nuclear fuel cycles, and especially their relationship to the NPT, to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, kind of to explore what legal parameters are actually set by this treaty. And one reason for that, as Corey mentioned earlier in an analogy of the gun debate, the legal norms play an important role, especially since a lot of opposition to these NMAs is based on Article 4 of the treaty. There's always been quite a lot of opposition to the concept of these multilateral approaches. There's a lot of distrust, especially in non-aligned states. And in 2010 at the NPT Review Conference, the final document included a passage that said that states parties would continue to discuss approaches to the multilateral approaches to the nuclear fuel cycle without affecting the rights under the treaty. Somehow these rights under the treaty, this quite open and vague term, should be elaborated a bit further. Now, I don't have the pretension that I will do that today, but at least maybe I can try to sketch some of the boundaries. First of all, what is the relationship between the NPT and these multilateral approaches? Principally, the NPT is an arms control treaty. Arms control have been defined as efforts to reduce the likelihood of war and limit the effects if it occurs. And consequently, the ultimate goal of the NPT is the prevention of global nuclear war and the promotion of international peace and security through non-proliferation. It's important to remember that non-proliferation is not the goal in itself. How to interpret the NPT? Very quickly, the rules of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties are applicable to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which means that it can be interpreted looking at subsequent agreements and practice that give guidance for the implementation of the treaty. And for this you can, for example, think of review conference documents. And one can also look at the negotiating phase, the documents that are available that indicate how the treaty was negotiated. First of all, the non-proliferation obligations of the treaty in Articles 1 and 2. This is basically the core obligations of the treaty. If you look at the text, these articles have actually some loopholes in them. For example, if you read it, you'll see that nuclear weapon states are not literally prohibited from assisting other nuclear weapon states in, developing their program. Non-nuclear weapon states under the treaty, under the text of the treaty, are not prohibited from giving assistance to any other nuclear weapon program. However, these textual loopholes were closed off over the years by means of this subsequent agreement and practice. It is important to remember that the non-proliferation obligation under the NPT is absolute and is reinforced, for example, also by Security Council Resolution 1540, which compels states to take and enforce effective measures to prevent nuclear proliferation. Another problem with Articles 1 and 2 is that it's not completely defined what the manufacturer of a nuclear weapon is. There was a discussion about this during the negotiations of the treaty. In the end, there seemed to be a consensus that activities like uranium enrichment and reprocessing are definitely not considered as manufacturing of a nuclear weapon. Last thing I'll say about these obligations is that they are individual obligations on all NPT member states. The next part that could be relevant is Article 3.2, which basically obliges the NPT parties to undertake not to provide any equipment or nuclear material unless that material shall be subject to safeguards. So what it basically does is it sets safeguard standards for recipient states, but the obligation not to provide this material is on the supplier states. The question then ensues, what is the safeguard standards under this particular provision? I would argue that these are comprehensive safeguards agreements, Article IMCIRC 153 of the IAEA documents. However, this should be taken as a minimum standard. There is nothing that prevents states from adopting higher standards. The limit to these guarantees that states may require under the treaty are that they may not infringe the rights under Article 4. So the question is, what infringes such rights? Article 4, as I think you all know, established the inalienable right of every NPT state party to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. It's important to remember that this article does not create this right. This right exists independent of the NPT. It first of all limits the right to peaceful nuclear energy by linking it to the non-proliferation obligations of the treaty. What it also does, however, is it safeguards the right, and it essentially says this right may only be limited based on the NPT. Now, the problem here is that the scope of this right to peaceful nuclear energy, when does it conflict with Article 1 and 2, has remained quite unclear over the decades, and it's been debated a lot. However, as I pointed out earlier, when one goes back to the negotiation phase, it is clear that, for example, enrichment or reprocessing technologies are protected by this right. Just quickly to finally point out, this is just a negative obligation that I've just been describing, which means that states shall not infringe or hinder other states when they try to establish a peaceful nuclear program. But there's also a positive obligation in this article, which is more of an obligation of result. And let me explain, during the negotiations of the treaty, there were some concerns by states that it's not enough that states guarantee not to violate these rights, but there must also be some kind of positive action, which is, for example, the guarantee that fuel will be supplied, because otherwise states that do not have their own uranium deposits will never be able to have a peaceful nuclear program. So here is a kind of a collective obligation to ensure that all states have, you know, basic access to peaceful uses of nuclear energy, which on the other hand conflicts with the rights of individual states to determine their own policy. There's no one that can oblige Austria, which doesn't even have its own nuclear program, to supply any other country with enrichment technology, of course. So just to shortly to sum up, any multilateral approach to the nuclear fuel cycle cannot absolve any state from its individual non-proliferation obligations under Articles 1 and 2 of the NPT. They can still be held responsible even if they participate in such a multilateral initiative. They cannot require participating states to sign away their rights to enrichment or reprocessing. However, individual states, when trading with another state, can actually make such demands. The conclusion, I would say, is that the NPT leaves a large margin of political appreciation. And maybe while some of the outer boundaries are clear, member states must really discuss and agree on further modalities within this legal framework. Why is this important? It's important, I think, because this might create the trust among all NPT member states, especially non-aligned states, that is necessary to really make a success of any multilateral approach to the nuclear fuel cycle.
Thank you, Tom.
That was me.
Caroline.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Corey. And I want to thank Azan for inviting me for this interesting meeting. My point will not be legal, but more practical and a political concept. And as I have had the pleasure to participate both in the IAEA M&A study and in the industrial initiative, I will first and foremost discuss and expose what is my view on that. So first the concept, then I will look into the actual implementation, looking into the prospects for the M&A. As you know, I mean, this name, multinational approaches, M&A, was developed some years ago. It's almost 10 years, I think, in context where there was some prospect for a very significant expansion of nuclear. It was what we call the nuclear renaissance. And it was felt that it was wise to avoid any unnecessary dissemination of sensitive facilities, sensitive technology facilities. We were talking about, and we're still talking about, enrichment and reprocessing. We were not talking about heavy water. And the idea was that there was a need, legal need, to guarantee the supplies to those who needed it in a sustainable, reliable, and economical manner, while assuring non-proliferation. So the M&A concept came out from, I think it was maybe in 2003. Anyway, IAEA launched the multinational approaches expert group in June 2004. There were many different meetings, and the objectives were to see what were the schemes for increasing non-proliferation assurances associated with the civilian nuclear fuel cycle, and preserving assurances of supply and services. So assurances of non-proliferation, assurances of supply. The group, which was a really large group, with industry representatives, government representatives, NGOs, ended up with a report which was published as INFCIRC 640 in February 2005. And so this still exists. The M&A concept found that there were three types of assurances. The first one was to get assurances of services not involving ownership of facilities. So the first one was in type 1, first type of assurance, the suppliers could provide additional assurances of supply. Second, international consortia of governments could broaden these assurances. And third, IAEA-related arrangements could provide even further broader assurances. So this was for the first type without involving ownership of facilities. Second type was the conversion of existing national facilities to multinational facilities. And as you can think, of course, this is found to be more difficult to turn existing national facilities into multinational. And the third type was a construction of new joint facilities for the future. There were different discussions about the options, about the different elements, the pros and the cons of, and the report ended with 5 proposed options. So the 5 proposed options are taken from the 3 types that we already discussed. The first one was to reinforce existing market mechanism through long-term government-backed up fuel lease, storage, commercial fuel bank. All these were proactive industry and government-backed processes. The second one was implement international supply guarantees with IAEA having a very important role, central role, and IAEA as an administrator of a fuel bank. The third one was to promote the voluntary conversion of existing plants and facilities to M&A. So this corresponds to the second type. The third one was new M&As for new facilities, and including joint ownership, drawing rights, or co-management for front-end and back-end nuclear facilities, such as enrichment, fuel reprocessing, disposal, and storage of spent fuel. And the fifth one was nuclear fuel cycle, and I think we go back to Corey's proposal with stronger multilateral arrangements by region or continent and broader cooperation involving international community and IAEA. So this was basically the M&A report. On that, the industry decided that they couldn't live, without doing anything, because, well, they were suspected in a way. We were talking about inciting industry to go into multinational facilities. And so WNA, the World Nuclear Association, decided to launch a working group on this issue in August 2005. There were 3 meetings, and they came out with WNA assurances of supply in May 2006, which was a booklet, and which was revisited lately in 2012. So I will not go into the deep thing, but the basic concern was to say that the existing market, the private, could ensure a satisfying security of supply with a number of competing industries in the enrichment, less so in reprocessing, but the capacity was enough to secure security of supply. In addition to that, the second level of guarantee was a collective guarantee, a sort of reassurance as you have in the banking industry, so that if one supplier would fail for some reason, and because, for example, he would not be allowed to export because his government would not allow to export to a certain country, not for non-proliferation matters, then the remaining three others enrichers would provide and supply what was on the contract. So the idea was to have a sort of solidarity between enrichers and to ensure that anyhow, when you have a contract, if you are in a country without any non-proliferation or proliferation concerns, then you would get your contract. And the third one was the government IAEA EUP stocks. So this corresponded to the idea of these fuel banks. So, 10 years later, where are we? First, there are new developments on the front end. The IAEA Global Nuclear Fuel Bank was approved by the Board of Governors in December 2010 with $200 million worth, from which NTI, which launched really this idea, put $50 million, then the US government $50 million, the EU 32, I think the Emirates 10, Kuwait 10, and Norway 2, I think, or 5. So this was really launched, but it still lacks a proper process, the location, how much, where it will be, and I think the scheme. The second one is the Russian initiatives. First, the International Enrichment Center in Angarsk was created, and with an access of Ukraine, I think, and Kazakhstan. And a second initiative was the fuel reserve, 120 tons of stockpiled low enriched uranium, which was announced in November 2010. Third one was the US initiative. What is called American Assured Fuel Supply corresponds to 230 tons of low enriched uranium, which comes from diluted HEU or down-blended HEU, and this was announced in August 2011. Another way these M&A concepts were being implemented in a way is through sharing ownership. In France, the facility, a company which was set to run the new centrifuge plant is now owned by 10% only, but 10% by GDF Suez, Japanese consortium, and Korean. Second one, the Global Laser Enrichment Project in the US is US, and with some share, 25 for Japan and 24 for Canada. Another scheme is the delocalization. The Areva enrichment plant in Eagle Rock and the Uranco plant in New Mexico are two ways of M&A in a way, if you will. The ownership is European, and it's located in another country. It happens to be, happily I think, in a country where there is already this enrichment technology. So the prospects for the future. Enrichment capacity, no tension, there is no tension on the market right now. There is a modernized and expanded capacity, and there is a recent experience with building up capacity in a rather short term. So I don't think that there is any difficulty on this side. There are new opportunities for M&A. The UK sells its share or some share in Uranco. Maybe some countries or companies, foreign companies can buy it. New partnership may be also launched, and investment in foreign countries like the Areva Uranco example may be a new opportunity, a new scheme. As for reprocessing, there is no new capacity, no new demand, no new major contracts. Much maybe will depend in Japan with the situation with the Rokashomura, and much will depend on the future, on the prospect for fuel cycle strategy and the Gen 4 models, if you will. As on waste management, there are no regional or international storages as yet, no regional or international repositories, and there is some need for national achievements, and as was told, there are some beginning of national achievements. So in the future, I think it will make sense to have multinational or regional sites. So conclusions, I think multinational approaches make sense for non-proliferation and rationalizing safeguards implementation. You can safeguard any type of facilities. You can safeguard reprocessing facilities, but it costs you efforts. It costs you manpower. So if you have a reduced number of facilities, it's easier. Security of supply for the same. I think you can have a good security or better security of supply if you are multinational. But also for safety and security issues. If you have a smaller number of sensitive facilities, I think security issues is reduced to a few secure countries. Economics, of course, is a major point. And also regional or global models for nuclear energy development. And I am thinking of the Middle East, for example. If they go nuclear, maybe it will make sense to go on a regional basis. And so multinational approaches are a good thing. So to conclude, multinational approaches could be extended to reactors. These ideas have been floated. To research reactors, I think it makes sense. To burners, we were talking about the end of the fuel cycle. I think there are some technologies to burn actinides, and maybe you don't need to have all over the world such specific reactors, and also for NPPs. Also, multinational approaches could be, one point is that multinational approaches need broad partnership between private and government, financial and technical experts, national, international sectors, and NGOs can give the impetus, as it's shown, the different initiatives that have been launched, and I'm talking about the NTI. So back to INFCIRC 640, the report of the expert group says this report will serve as a building block or as a milestone. It is not intended to mark the end of the road. M&As offer a potentially useful contribution to meeting prevailing concerns about assurances of supply and non-proliferation. And so I think that this is still going to be debated during some years. Thank you for your attention.
Appreciate that. Jung Min.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Asan Institute to having me this distinguished forum. Nuclear power contributes energy security and provides environmental benefits by producing little carbon dioxide. For the sustainable nuclear power, nuclear fuel supply assurance and spent fuel management are key facts which are closely related with uranium enrichment and reprocessing, respectively. However, uranium enrichment provides the means to make highly enriched uranium a route to nuclear weapons, while reprocessing provides the means to separate plutonium, another route to nuclear weapons, from the spent fuel discharged from the reactors. If countries of non-nuclear weapon state to the NPT try to develop domestic capabilities in uranium enrichment and reprocessing, it would increase proliferation risk from those nuclear fuel cycle activities, like Iran. This is the reason why multilateral approaches in nuclear fuel cycle activities are strongly recommended to those countries, not only to succeed their nuclear power programs, but also to resolve the world concerns on nuclear proliferation. So let me firstly talk about the spent fuel management issues. Management of spent fuel discharged from nuclear reactors is one of the big challenges of the nuclear power industry. Two spent fuel strategies are currently being used by countries. One is reprocessing of the spent fuel, and the other is interim storage of spent fuel with the object of either direct disposal or reprocessing. The reprocessing strategy separates plutonium either stored for fossil future use in fast reactor or recycled as mixed oxide MOX fuel in light water reactors. Reprocessing. The countries adopting the reprocessing strategy includes France, Japan, India, Russia, and UK. As we know, the reprocessing using Furex technology is uneconomic. As a MIT study examined, a MOX option of reprocessing spent fuel and recycling the separated plutonium in MOX fuel cost roughly 4 times more expensive than the MOX option. Professor Frank Van Hippel of Princeton University similarly concluded that reprocessing spent fuel and recycling the separated plutonium in MOX fuel would double the cost of the back-end fuel cycle than without reprocessing. Furthermore, the cost of reprocessing would be 10 times more than that of the on-site storage of spent fuel, considering fast reactors recycle, according to Frank Van Hippel. Besides no economic merit, the reprocessing fosters a proliferation risk. Separated plutonium can be carried away easily and is much more vulnerable than spent light water reactor fuel that is self-protecting for more than a century. Environmental benefits by reprocessing is not significant since spent MOX fuel is not reprocessed, and high-level waste that contains all the fission products and transuranics other than plutonium should be disposed in geologic disposal site. Reprocessing also does not guarantee nuclear fuel security. Recycling plutonium once in MOX fuel replaces less than 20% of uranium oxide fresh fuel, since depleted uranium obtained from the reprocessed process is not recycled. Then why reprocessing persists in some countries? Reprocessing continues in Western Europe and Japan, in part because of a combination of local political pressures to do something about the problem of spent fuel accumulating at the reactor site, and not in my backyard political opposition elsewhere to geologic repository was central interim storage facilities for spent fuel. So that means the reprocessing provides an interim destination for the spent fuel. However, we have an alternative to reprocessing for provision of an interim destination for the spent fuel, on-site dry cask storage. Compared with reprocessing, on-site dry cask storage of spent fuel is economic, estimated approximately 100 to 200 US dollar per kilogram of spent fuel for the cost of dry cask storage. The on-site dry cask storage of spent fuel is proliferation resistant. For example, a pressurized water reactor spent fuel assembly requires heavy container to transport and remote reprocessing behind the thick walls to recover plutonium. With respect to safety aspect, the on-site dry cask storage of spent fuel is safer than pool storage option, since the consequences of accident and the attacks on dry cask stored spent fuel would be orders of magnitude less than from attacks on reactors or storage pools. The on-site dry cask storage of spent fuel is durable and requires a small space on-site. The dry casks can sustain more than 60 years of operation and possibly more than 100 years. The dry cask storage only requires a space of approximately 0.2 square kilometers for 40,000 tons of spent fuel. In principle, countries will have to dispose of their spent fuel domestically. However, due to difficulty in citing a geologic repository, interest in regional international spent fuel storage disposal increased since the 1970s. In 1977, the IAEA reported that the regional fuel cycle centers were feasible and would offer considerable non-proliferation and economic advantages. In 1982, the IAEA concluded a project of the International Fuel Cycle Evaluation, INFOS, in which IAEA expert group suggested an establishment of international plutonium storage and international spent fuel management. As well explained by previous speakers, as MNA, in 2003, Mohamed El-Baradei, the Director General of IAEA, suggested a multinational approach to the management and disposal of spent fuel and radioactive waste. In 2005, Commission at Dr. El-Baradei's suggestion in 2003, the IAEA published a report on multilateral approaches to the nuclear fuel cycle, in which the IAEA concluded that such approaches are needed and worth pursuing on both security and economic grounds. The regional international spent fuel storage disposal could provide benefits to a host country and to participating countries. It gives an alternative for countries that seem to have no positive prospects for domestic siting, for interim storage or disposal for spent fuel, mainly due to political resistance from local communities. It creates a new revenue source for host country. The host country that accommodates a regional international repository could receive a significant income through payments by participating countries. It reduces the proliferation risk by avoiding unnecessary accumulation of separated plutonium. A regional international repository would offer an alternative place for spent fuel and thus avoid unnecessary reprocessing. To implement a regional international spent fuel storage disposal, two main obstacles must be overcome. One is ethical issues in the region. There is some public perception that countries that have the benefits of nuclear power generation should bear the burden of storing and disposing of their radioactive waste. This argument raises ethical and fairness issues that would oppose the concept of a regional international repository. The other obstacle is increasing transportation requirements in the region. The regional international repository will involve frequent transportation of spent fuel radioactive waste from participating countries to host country, and increasing concern over nuclear accidents during the transportation that may lead radioactive release to the environment. Proliferation risks due to diversion of materials during transport are also concerned. Finally, let me briefly talk about the uranium enrichment issues. The provision of reliable, uninterrupted supply of fresh fuel for nuclear power plants without discouraging the nuclear non-proliferation regime and preventing spread of critical nuclear technology, uranium enrichment, are a key factor for the success of a nuclear power project. For the nuclear fuel supply assurance, a multilateral approach to the nuclear fuel cycle, especially uranium enrichment, is an important concept to dissuade a country developing national enrichment capability. There are more than 10 proposals on nuclear fuel supply assurance since the mid-2000s, from NTI's Fuel Bank to Russia's International Uranium Enrichment Center. All the proposals on the nuclear fuel supply assurance are aiming at finding a solution to achieve objectives of both nuclear non-proliferation and secured access to nuclear fuel for all interested countries. At the same time, most of those proposals require potential consumer countries to be placed under a strict international monitoring regime, including the IAEA safeguards. In return for providing guaranteed access to nuclear fuel for their nuclear power plants and giving up for sure their national enrichment capability as well. It is worth to note that the most of the proposals on the nuclear fuel supply assurance come from potential fuel supply countries, and none from the countries that presumably want the assurance. Supplier countries might have their own interest in driving for instituting the multilateral nuclear fuel supply assurance mechanisms. It would be natural for consumer countries to raise a demand for creating new nuclear fuel supply assurance scheme, meeting with their own interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Jungmin. Finally, Will. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey, and I'm grateful to the Asan Institute for the invitation to participate in what's already a fascinating discussion. I hope that I won't seem churlish in response to that invitation if, at the outset of my brief talk, I challenge the assumption of the question. I'd have two observations. The first is that the spread of certain fuel cycle technology is far more important than whether or not international management is involved. If you doubt me, consider how many of you would think that an international fuel cycle facility located 50 miles north of here would be a good idea. It's the technology that matters, not necessarily the management, for a variety of reasons. Second, while enrichment and reprocessing are often lumped together in these discussions, they have different risks and different characteristics, and it's important to understand those in the discussion. The detailed outline of the question we were to discuss in this session mentions the closed cycle, closing the nuclear fuel cycle. So I have, and many of the earlier speakers have outlined the existing system present today. So I would just limit my comments to three observations about the concept of a closed nuclear fuel cycle. First, multilateral or unilateral, the arguments for a closed nuclear fuel cycle are not yet compelling. Typically, 5 arguments are advanced in favor of a closed nuclear fuel cycle. First is cost. Professor Kong's already mentioned the MIT Future of Nuclear Power study in 2009, which I think convincingly indicates that the cost of recycle is unfavorable compared to once through, at least with today's technologies. A second argument is made in favor of waste management. There again, the study concluded that we do not believe a convincing case can be made on the basis of waste management considerations alone, that the benefits of reprocessing will outweigh the attendant safety, environmental, and security considerations and economic costs. Third, and related to the second point, is the not in my backyard concern regarding storage. The view that storage sites are difficult to locate and that there will be some form of public pushback against long-term storage. There, I would argue that the environmental and safety risks associated with reprocessing are at least as high and likely higher than medium-term dry cask storage, especially if new technologies such as pyroprocessing are involved. A fourth argument in favor of it is energy security, that closing the fuel cycle would make countries less dependent on supply of uranium. Here I would note that actually multilateral provisions can be helpful, and further that there's little evidence of either a uranium shortage or restrictions that have interrupted supply of fresh fuel. With new discoveries and scaled back plans for nuclear power plant use and producers of uranium that are diverse, often politically stable and committed to free trade, it doesn't seem to be a compelling concern. And then finally, at times, technological development has been advanced as an argument in favor of closing the fuel cycle. And while I'm in favor of additional research that might provide technologies that would offer a more cost-competitive alternative and perhaps non-proliferation advantages, as yet, the reprocessing technology is something of a cul-de-sac. It doesn't provide a country with any particular competitive advantage in other commercial fields. The point that I would make about a closed fuel cycle is that medium-term interim storage in dry casks is a viable option. It's cost-effective, flexible, allowing for implementation of better technologies at a later date if they do come about. It's relatively safe, that is, it's safer than the alternatives. And I would finally observe that in no other realm of public policy is a standard set that solving a problem for about 100 years or so is not sufficient. And I'm somewhat puzzled by the arguments sometimes made about longer-term storage that, well, that isn't a long-term solution to the problem. I think solving it for a century and then allowing for technological improvements is a prudent course of action. The third point I would make about a closed cycle is that a multilateral approach is not a non-proliferation panacea. Admittedly, back in enrichment, the greatest non-proliferation disaster in history, from my perspective anyway, resulted from a multilateral program. Heikyu Kan's use of Urenco technology to spread enrichment capabilities now, unfortunately, throughout the world. So I would conclude with the point that a much more significant driver in terms of our choices regarding the fuel cycle should be the spread of technology for the enrichment or disposition path rather than multilateral control.
Thank you, Will. So we've come to the discussion portion, and since we have 5 speakers on this panel, and all but maybe I'll give credit to Will, took the maximum of their time as opposed to the minimum, I'd like to turn to the audience sooner rather than later. So let me just pose one very quick question and then one question for discussion, and then I'll be turning to you all, so get your good questions ready. So the very quick question, I would love a yes or no answer, literally a yes or no answer from each member of the panel. Setting aside whether multilateral is the right solution, is there a problem with the current system that needs to be addressed with regard to pursuit of sensitive fuel cycle technology?
Yes.
Carlene?
I'm going to be a Norman. Yes and no.
Oh, yes and no. Okay. Jungmin?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
Will?
Yes.
Okay. The reason I pose it that way is because, we often start these discussions with a whole lot of, toing and froing of what do we do, what do we not do, and then it always comes back to somebody rightly saying, what is the problem we're trying to solve? So I wanted to start our discussion by just trying to get a little bit of consensus, at least among the panel, because I would answer yes, that there is a problem. Now, how we define that problem and then how do we solve it, that's the source of all of our jobs for the next 25 years. So let me move on to one discussion question that will allow the panelists to say something with a little bit more meat, and then we'll turn to the audience. I'm wondering what you all think of the effect of recent events, and of this I would put the category of the Fukushima disaster, the economic downturn, and accompanying changes in certain countries' plans for nuclear energy expansion, Iran and DPRK using sensitive fuel cycle technologies for potentially negative consequences. Do these events create an opportunity for change by highlighting challenges, or are they actually releasing the pressure on the system for change because they're either changing our perception of risk or funneling our approaches to addressing those risks in different directions. Would anyone like to say something about that? No. Okay, Will, I'm going to make you say something and then maybe our other panelists will have a chance.
Well, I guess to elaborate on my yes to your first question, I think that the threat to the nonproliferation regime is acute but limited. I think it's really a small number of countries, Iran, North Korea, that pose the greatest threat. So, returning to your premise, which I completely agree with, it's important to remember what you're trying to accomplish. The offer of multilateral approaches in the fuel cycle can be helpful, but not with respect to the most acute problems. And there may be reasons to pursue multilateralism, but not to solve the most pressing nonproliferation concerns.
Okay. Did anyone want to add to that, or should we turn to the audience?
Yes, I would
Okay,
just
Caroline?
respond to one of your points. I agree with you. It doesn't make all, but it certainly can help. But multinational approaches is beneficial whatsoever you choose a closed fuel cycle or not. And the matter is not against closed fuel cycle. It's about M&A. Does M&A bring something to the system? If a country wants to go closed cycle for some reasons, it's better to go M&A. That's, I think, fair to say.
First question? Yes. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thanks, all panelists. I'm Il-sun Hwang of Seoul National University. Are any of our panelists is aware that on lab scale, the engineers have demonstrated we can eliminate high-level waste, turn them into something in equivalent quality as website waste?
Okay.
Are
Jung-min,
any
do
of
you want to answer
you
that?
aware of that progress in technology
At the lab scale.
on
Yeah,
lab scale?
And the labs. Jung-min, you're our resident scientist here.
Yeah, it's very hard for me to to say about that. But that kind of research, small scale research, should be pursued by nuclear engineering side to solve this spent fuel problem in the future. But frankly speaking, I'm not sure. But all high level waste can be converted into low level waste to
Then-
be,
Suppose that is demonstrated positive, then anybody else believe this is a very significant piece that might change your opinion or not?
Well, and speaking for myself, I think we had said that there was, that I had said that I don't think that a technical fix is going to be the answer here. There are always going to need to be political and institutional arrangements around any technology. And I think by waiting for a technical magic bullet, we will unfortunately avoid opportunities. Dr. Wong, I'm afraid we do have to move on, but I encourage you to continue this conversation afterward. Ambassador.
End of Japan, I would like to say just a few things. I also was a member of a expert study group of Erabardai, together with Joland. And, but that group put an emphasis upon front-end side of nuclear fuel cycle because it's easier than back-end. So as a result of its study, in front-end, two proposals came out as its implementation. One, as you said, IAEA fuel bank. The other, as far as I understand, Russian-sponsored enrichment bank. But as I said, fuel cycle, particularly back end, is so difficult to deal with from the point of multilateralism. But looking at East Asia, many countries, well, in addition to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, some other countries are coming out as, so to speak, emerging nuclear countries. Vietnam already. Then perhaps after Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, or some other countries may come out. So the problem is how to deal with back end, particularly disposal of waste and also reprocessing. I myself in Japan, we have been contemplating how to do multilateral MNS, multilateral nuclear approaches in the field of back end. But still, we haven't got any conclusion yet. So therefore, my question goes to Jolante. How do you draw a picture of East Asia for nuclear fuel cycle, particularly back end? That's one. Secondly, I just would like to add to the statement of Professor Toby. Well, Japan is going to study direct disposal of nuclear waste in addition to fuel cycle. Reprocessing, and also going to introduce dry cask storage. So my question goes to her.
Thank you for the clarification, Ambassador Endo, on the second point, and Caroline, the question to you on the first point.
Okay, very quickly. The first answer for the back end is make use of the facilities you have. So if you have a reprocessing facility, and if some countries need reprocessing services, well, you should offer multinational access to your facility. I mean, you don't increase the proliferation risk. Second, I would say, and having in mind Euratom, if you have a number of countries starting with new nuclear power, maybe they will like to really start it together. And then, I suppose, if you have the back end of the fuel cycle in mind, I should advise them, 2 or 3 of them, look into their national territories if they have a site which is gifted for this use, and in the time, because you will have 40 years at least until you really need it, you can select 1 or 2 of those sites to have a multinational repository. I think the difficult thing is in Europe, for example, if you have just one country while you are looking for a national repository, and if all the other counts on yourself, you will have immediately a public opinion, a problem with acceptance. Whereas if you have the several countries with large size power plants, looking for national repositories, then I think it's easier to handle the public acceptance, because then they will not think we will be the dustbin of Europe, and then you can manage for the other smaller maybe capacities. I think there is some project in Europe, for example, for small capacities, small countries with not very huge inventories of waste, to get together and maybe have one waste disposal for all small of them. So I think you have different ways to do it. But the easiest, I think, would be to handle this question from the start. From the start, when you start your power plant program.
Yeah,
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I
Just I'd
Yes,
like to
John.
add, about the back-end fuel cycle in East Asia. Is there any reason to hurry to close the back-end fuel cycle? We can wait it because, even to reduce the burden of spent fuel from disposal site, we need the fast reactor. The commercialization of fast reactor might be expected in 2050 or later. There is no reason to hurry to close the fuel cycle. You can safely store it on-site by dry storage.
So at the risk of alienating friends Jim and Josh, since we are only going to have time for one more question, and the first hand I'd seen previously was Bill Potter, so I'm going to turn to Bill and then give all of our panelists a chance to respond to him and say anything final that they'd like to say.
Thank you, Corey. Looking around the room, I think I'm probably as close to a representative from the non-aligned movement in the developing world as anyone else here. So I feel somewhat obliged to my colleagues about whom I write to ask a question which seems to have been overlooked or at least ignored by the panelists here. You're talking about very politically provocative proposals, in particular your reference to kind of rethinking the issue of Article 4. But even if one were to be more modest and simply embrace the M&A approach, I think most NAM representatives would say if you're going to go down that route, are we talking about, again, a discriminatory approach in which this approach applies to some countries? Or are we really truly talking about an M&A approach that applies to all states, including those which seem to be most interested in other countries embracing this particular approach?
Thank you for the comment, Bill. So let's go in reverse order and give our panel a chance to respond to anything that was said, and then we will just wrap up. So 30 seconds apiece.
Well, the points I made about closing the fuel cycle apply to developed countries as well as the developing world. So I don't view it as discriminatory. I think saving them from costly investments that will only bring them heartache would be a favor.
Jungmin?
I already, said
Okay.
about it.
Carlene, anything to finish up with?
Well, two proposals. The first one is irreversible safeguards. I think if you have M&As in nuclear weapon states, maybe you should offer to have irreversible safeguards on those to ensure that you are on the same level as non-weapon states. Second proposal to strengthen the safeguards, the security of supply, would be to have NSG positive assurance of supply, and not only restrictive positions.
Thank you. Great. Tom?
Yeah, I think this ties a bit into what you want to achieve with the multilateral approaches. If you just look at it as a way to restrict the spread of technology, it's never going to work, because obviously a lot of countries will simply not accept it, and I would argue even rightly so. But there's also this positive type of collaboration effort to it that you might be able to build on. So maybe it would be worth more to look at it that way, as some kind of confidence-building measure to create more international cooperation, also between the North and the South, and see if you can't create some kind of common trust and confidence, and from that on you can try to develop new rules, new norms.
Great. And I'll just end by saying that I agree with you, Bill, that we have to have the same rules of the road for everybody. But I would also say that for the developing world and the non-aligned, there has to be a moment at which they start to actively articulate what they want to see, and not just to express their concerns about the proposals being made by others. In the IAEA context, this opportunity has been given many times to a room of resounding silence. And so until we start getting proposals from those who are actively needing that assurance, we're just going to keep throwing things out and seeing what sticks. So on that note, I would just thank all of the panelists, all of the participants. It's a warm room. It's a long day. Thank you all.